Hi, everyone. Hi. It worked. We're just getting things underway, and it looks like we're good to go. So, good afternoon, good early evening. My name's Jennifer Evans, and I'm a professor of history here at Carleton University. It's my immense pleasure to welcome you to this opportunity to learn more about disability justice through artistic curation. The quest to better understand one another in a way that honors our differences lies really at the heart of what we do, some of us as educators and most of us as just beings in the world. It's especially urgent in our times, in the times that we are living in. And we are fortunate here in this space on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people, but also on Turtle Island more broadly, to have as interlocutors and guides the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who've sought to deepen human relations, ever mindful of our individual and collective responsibilities to each other and to the land. We're honored to be their guests here today, to continue learning and practicing ways to bring dignity and understanding into our world. And we need that now more than ever. Before introducing our speaker to you today, I have a few organizational notes. One is that this talk, you've noticed maybe, is being live streamed on our Carleton University History Department YouTube channel, where it will also be available after the event, so you can pass it on to friends. If during the Q&A you might not want to appear on camera, we are taking that into consideration. And if you really don't want to appear, maybe you can raise your hand, and our videographer will take note and make sure that the camera isn't lingering in your direction. So if anybody has concerns that way, feel free to signal them. We're grateful to Carleton's IT services and to Jeff Paul for helping us out here, and to Mick Zowski. This event is being accompanied by sign language interpretation by a sign, for whom we're extremely grateful. For the on-campus audience, please know that if at any time you wish to move about the room or take a break, you should feel absolutely free to do so. We want you to enjoy this afternoon in the way that works for you. Kenny will speak approximately 40 minutes and show several slides, after which he will gladly accept questions from you, the audience. And there is food. Feel free to sneak some anytime now or even at the end of the event. We wouldn't be able to organize or host this event if it weren't for the help and support of several people and organizations here at Carleton. The funding for this afternoon comes from the Carleton University Shirk Knowledge Exchange Grant and the Humboldt Foundation. I want to thank Sarah Adam and the Carleton Office for Research Initiatives and Services for all their help securing this funding to help make this happen. Several other units here at the university have contributed to the afternoon, including the Department of History, the Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture, Cultural Mediations, the Carleton University Art Gallery, and the School for Studies in Art and Culture. We've also benefited from the input and expertise of members of the Carleton University Disability Research Group. And I'd personally like to thank Laura Horak, Heather Anderson, and Kelly Fritsch for their feedback and guidance all along the way. But we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the indispensable work of the History Department's Finu LeBron. She has done all of the heavy lifting. God, I get so emotional. And is actually the real reason for this afternoon's success. And perhaps we might give her, who's sitting right at the front, a round of applause for our collective effort. And now to introduce our speaker, Kenny Fries, who is a source of light in the darkness. An internationally renowned writer, poet, curator, cultural critic. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, and his projects have secured funding from the Fulbright Foundation, the Bellagio Center, the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts, and Canada's own Canada Council. He edited Staring Back, The Disability Experience from the Inside Out, and curated the wildly successful and groundbreaking Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, the first international exhibit on queer disability, history, activism, and culture at the Schwules Museum in Berlin. And we're going to hear a lot about that this afternoon. He's currently finishing a book entitled Stumbling Over History, Disability and the Holocaust, which takes up this dark chapter in German history with lessons for us all, even more urgent today. Kenny is, as you can tell by this short introduction, a powerhouse of a human being, and I'm honored to call him a friend. Amidst all that he does as an activist, scholar, and as an advocate, he also finds the time to mentor young, disabled, queer, and non-binary artists and helps them find their audiences. In short, he makes things happen. And I'm so pleased to welcome him to Carleton today. And I'm crying.
So I lived in Canada. My husband is Canadian, then I became Canadian. And I just let you know that I lived here for almost 7 years and was never invited to speak anywhere. And this past week, I've spoken first in Halifax and now here in Ottawa, and the turnouts have just been amazing. It's just really gratifying to see this. So now I'm going to do my magic trick, which I do is I can't see this without these, and then I won't be able to see you. So it's kind of a strange thing, but that's the way it happens. So I'm going to start with some framing and then talk about how Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer happened, because I think it's really instrumental to know how things like these big projects happen and how long it took. And take you through some of the exhibit. I'm going to be highlighting some of the 3 Canadian artists, amongst some others that were in the exhibit. And hopefully it won't go on too long, but I don't know, I've never timed it before, so we'll see how it goes. I might have to cut and paste as we go along. I'm sure I will make mistakes using the PowerPoint because I'm just that way. So let's see if it works. It does. So what is access? So access is not only physical access. As necessary as physical access is, access must always include disability representation by disabled artists, not only in disability-focused projects, but dare I say, in all projects. And please don't use the word inclusion. Inclusion connotes there are people who hold the power to include. Most often, these gatekeepers are non-disabled. Inclusion seems like charity, and the very idea of inclusion seems excluding. Sometimes the language we use is excluding. Actually worse, the language we use is too often harmful, but the same can be said for images. So when I read this short excerpt from a column I wrote in 2018, just replace the word language with the word images. Precision with language is essential, branding expert Elizabeth Tallerman told me in a recent email conversation. We each attach a unique meaning to what we hear. We internalize language and interpret it based on our own experiences from the past or the present, from our mood in the moment. Words are first processed in the limbic brain, our emotional center, before meaning is made through our rationalizing frontal cortex. Kick off the wrong emotion, and all intended meaning may be lost. The language we use reveals assumptions we sometimes don't even realize. For example, disabled students are given special education, and disabled people are seen as having special needs. But there is nothing special about such education. The methods of learning might be different. There might be a need for certain accommodations. But how could the needs of an estimated 1 billion people who populate the world be called special? So the field of disability studies moves the model from the medical model, where the impairment is the disability, toward the social model, where it is the physical and attitudinal barriers that are the agents of disablement. We are still mired in the medical model, in which disability is viewed as an individual's issue or problem, not a societal or political issue. Again, from my 2018 column. Would changing the language we use change how those deemed other are seen and treated? The choice of each word may make the difference between piercing complacency or suffering the fate of indifference, between creating alignment or sowing the seeds of dissent. This is what Talaman observed in our conversation. Language is the greatest tool we have for connecting with people. Inaccurate words not only sow misunderstanding, but also dehumanize, which is probably why they are used, consciously or not, in the first place. Back to my words. This is neither a matter of political correctness nor about hurt feelings. Underlying these words are gross misunderstandings and suspect motivations, which lead to wrong-headed policy, denial of legal rights, and mistreatment of those with perceived differences. But I get a little bit ahead of myself. But this is the way I wanted to frame my talk today. The road to queering the crip and cripping the queer. So this will give you an idea of where I came from to lead up to this thing. So in my first memoir, Body Remember, 1997, I think. That's the reprint copy cover from 2003. This is the first paragraph from the book, Body Remember. Those afternoons I did not take the bus and chose to walk home from high school, I would find this boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, sitting on the stoop of the semi-detached house where I imagine he lived. Every time I passed, this boy asked, "Why are your legs the way they are?" And I would answer, "I was born that way, never stopping or slowing down." The next time I walked down that street, and there this boy was sitting on the stoop, and again he asked me his same question, and I gave him my same answer. That was the entirety of our exchange. Every time I walked down Bay 43rd Street in Brooklyn shortly after 3 in the afternoon, that boy and that question would be waiting for me. Never did I think of answering him in any other way, or not to answer him at all, nor did I ever stop to talk to him, and never did it occur to me that I could walk down another street, not see this boy, and evade his question. Now this is me in the present time, but I also learned the questions the boy asked are not my questions, nor the questions I want my life or my work to answer, but the questions I am seemingly forced to answer by others, as well as by the historically scripted cultural narrative of disability. Thus, my life and my work is set against the received narrative of disability. As I write in The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, similar to its attitude toward homosexuality in our culture, our culture demands explanations about most disabilities. The writer Joan Tollefson, who has one arm, has likened this question, "What happened to your arm?" to a koan mantra that follows her through life. When we speak of disability, we associate it with a story, place it in a narrative. A person became deaf, became blind, was born deaf, was born blind, became quadriplegic. The impairment becomes part of a sequential narrative. By doing this, we think of disability as linked to individualism and the individual story. What is actually a physical fact becomes a story with a hero or a victim. Disability becomes divorced from cultural context and becomes the problem of the individual, not a category defined by the society. The dialectic of normalcy, for someone to be normal, someone has to be not normal, is kept intact. So back in 1997, I edited Staring Back: The Disability Experience from the Inside Out, which was the first commercially published multi-genre anthology of disabled writers writing about disability in the United States. Long out of print, it's still used as a textbook. I love some of the things I did in that book are great. I kind of outed Adrienne Rich, the well-known poet, and as a disabled person, and because we started a lifelong correspondence after that. So in the introduction to Staring Back, remember this is 1997, I write, throughout history, people with disabilities have been stared at, defined by the gaze of and the needs of the non-disabled world. Writing by disabled writers has often seemed more as therapy than art. Disabled protagonists are not seen as universal, despite the fact that all of us at one time or another in our lives will be either temporarily or permanently disabled. Disability has more often been seen as used as a metaphor, and when an actual disabled life is depicted, it follows the medical model where the disability needs to be cured or killed. I'm not going to go into the long history of disability misrepresentation here, but just think about the characters throughout our literature and films, from Oedipus to Richard III to James Bond villains signified as evil by a disability. There'll be a bit more on this later. So I wrote a book called The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, 2007. It seems I have a book every 10 years, but I'm going to probably miss on the next 10 years. So in The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, I reframe what we think of as Darwinism. I used my actual shoes. I always remember what I've told my creative writing students for decades. For a metaphor to work, it first has to be something actual, to show how so much of what we take for granted is actually an adaptation, a variation. There's an episode in the book, which I would love to read, but there's not enough time, where after a trip, I take a trip down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon with a group of disabled people. And I realize that everything in my apartment when I come back is an adaptation. Go through the room, the tables, the chairs, the forks, the knife, everything is really an adaptation. And I also, which leads me to reframe Henri Matisse's late paper cutouts as the work of an artist who adapted to becoming late in life, a disabled artist. Not many people know that Matisse was disabled for the last decade of his life. And his cutouts had a lot to do with the fact that he couldn't manually draw with his hands anymore. So he used paper cutouts and put them on the wall. Not going. Told you there would be a. There it is. Yes. So then I went to Japan, and for a good decade, my work was based around Japan. This is just two of the things. And in one of my memoir, In the Province of the Gods, 2017, and also In the Gardens of Japan, a sequence of poems which has also been made into a song cycle working with a Japanese singer and a Japanese composer, and more recently we made a film with Allison, the deaf hard of hearing filmmaker Allison O'Daniel, which you can find on my YouTube channel, which I must say was supported by the Canada Council for the Arts. So this is just a paragraph from In the Province of the Gods about my intense experience with Japanese gardens and how that relates to disability. On the surface, these poems seem to be what I saw: the flowers, the tea houses, the rocks, bridges. But now, at the end of my stay in Japan, I realized that what was held in the gardens, a microcosm of what it means to be alive in a mortal world. And living in a mortal world is perhaps the greatest lesson learned from the experience of living with a disability. There is nothing more constant or moving than change. The Freeze test. Also in 2017, I developed this thing called the Freeze test, which kind of went semi-viral. It's on Medium, so I get statistics every week. It's usually around 50 reads a week, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. So it really hit a nerve. And it happened by accident. A colleague of mine where I taught at Goddard College, the creative writing program, we were about to leave and she was going off to do something. She says, oh, by the way, is there something for disability like the Bechdel test for women, the narrative? And I said, no. And she says, well, what would it be? And off the top of my head, I had these three things. And then I was about to publish a book and my publicist said, let's put that up on Medium. And it just went, it just went. And it's still going. So, it was created with literature, theater, and film in mind, but I think we can transfer this points to other art genres. So the three things are: does a work have more than one disabled character? Do the disabled characters have their own narrative purpose other than the education and profit of a non-disabled character? And is the character's disability not eradicated either by curing or killing? And so after this came out, God, why am I blanking on her name? The author of Hild. You can look it up later. She put a thing. She wrote on her blog this. She's a very well-known fantasy science fiction writer, and Nicola Griffiths. There you are. And she asked people to write in what this was all about. And then in the New York Times, she wrote how, if you go through the population that we have, we should have millions of these things that pass the Freeze test. And she came up to around 50 something. That was about it in all time. So there we had that. This is very strange. How many times do you think it'll take? No. Ah, see there, you just have to get up. And then, yeah, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about queer and disability history and memory, which also plays a very big part, which you'll see when I get to the exhibit, which is coming up pretty soon. So much of the past decade, I've been researching and writing Stumbling Over History, Disability, and the Holocaust, which is about Action T4, the Nazi program that mass murdered disabled people and its residents today. I'm going to read two brief paragraphs from it, but the event that I did in Halifax 2 nights ago was basically all about T4 and reading from this book, and it was live streamed and will be available in video. You could also go to my YouTube channel, and I have a series of 6 short 12-minute videos called What Happened Here in the Summer of 1940, also funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, and which I don't know how it happened. There's like over 114,000 views of these videos, and I did not do a thing. I just put it up on YouTube, and so that is always astounding to me. So in the book I write, unlike the Holocaust, there are no T4 survivors. We know about T4 and its aftermath mainly through medical records and from the perpetrators. Action T4 does not have its Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi. This is the main reason I write about what happened to disabled people during the Third Reich. I want to be what Suzanne C. Knittel and other scholars call a vicarious witness. Knittel describes this not as an act of speaking for and thus appropriating the memory and story of someone else, but rather an attempt to bridge the silence through narrative means. This book is my way to bridge the silence, to keep alive something that is too often forgotten. We will get back to this subject because it's a heart of queering the crip, cripping the queer. See, see, you're better at it, see? Okay, so queering the crip, cripping the queer. How did this thing happen? In 2015, I was invited to give a reading as part of the exhibition Homosexualities, which was held at the Schwules Museum and the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin. When I visited the exhibit, I found parts of the exhibit were inaccessible because my wheelchair would not fit. Texts were placed too high on the wall for me to read, and perhaps worst of all, there were only 2 very minor representations of disabled people in this major 2-museum exhibit. So before I read from my work that night, I briefly but very clearly addressed this inaccessibility. What I didn't know was that Birgit Bolsold, one of the curators of Homosexualities and member of the Schwules Museum Board of Directors, was there and would introduce me. After my reading, Birgit came over to me and said, "We should talk." And we did. When we talked, Birgit said to me, "You were right. I suggested we curate an exhibit on queer disability at the Schwules Museum." Thus started not only Queering the Crip, but also a valued friendship. Because anything to do with disability has been historically been marginalized and still is marginalized today, I knew this project had to be big. So I developed the idea of a queer disability performance festival with Anna Multer, the dance curator of Sophiensäle at the time. Thus, the corresponding performance festival was born. The cooperation of 2 Berlin cultural institutions that had never worked together before, with their complementary and mutually reinforcing structures, allowed for significant synergy and gives the work of queer disabled artists and our projects a strong presence in the broader public and in our communities. The making of Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, the title comes from Carrie Sandal's article, Queering the Crip or Cripping the Queer, is also the story about what allyship means. It takes allyship beyond private or personal relationships into what it can look like on an institutional level. It was crucial for an institution such as the Schwules Museum to live up to the claim of implementing allyship in its programming, collections, and policies, as well as developing more accurate presentations of history and culture. The question is, how can the museum support communities to reveal their own stories? In the end, it's about setting the stage and giving over the power to make the decisions to create, select, and present works and narratives of our own choosing. These stories not only allow us to thrive, but also deepen and enrich everyone's understanding of the world in which we live. In that sense, this exhibition was an important milestone for the museum. The music supposedly learned a lot, not only about how to ensure accessibility for all, but also about the fascinating connection of queerness and disability, and about great queer disabled icons such as Lorenzo Bottner, Raymond Hogue, and Audre Lorde, and their insights into our shared history. Our story shows how long it can take to realize an idea, from the first idea in the early summer of 2015 to the opening 7 years later on September 1st, 2022. In Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, we tell a queer disabled story from the perspective of being queer and disabled, focusing on the work of over 20 queer disabled international artists. We bring queer disabled art into dialogue with both historical and current issues. Queering the Crip was truly a first, and I hope that it was just a beginning in adequately presenting the voices of queer disabled artists in collective memory and cultural spaces. The commitment to a full access is a must-have for most cultural institutions today. However, this rarely means anything more than having ramps or Band-Aid guidance systems available. Real participation necessitates that people with disabilities co-shape culture as artists, curators, museum and theater directors, critics, editors, and publishers. There is still a lot of room for improvement. Disability study studies scholar Carrie Sandall writes, sexual minorities and people with disabilities share a history of injustice. Both have been pathologized by medicine, demonized by religion, discriminated against in housing, employment, and education, stereotyped in representation, victimized by hate groups, and isolated socially, often in their families of origin. Disability and queer histories are similar, if not always parallel. This is me again. Sometimes queers and the disabled acquiesce to the fantasy of, I put in quotes, the ideal body. But queer disabled artists mostly counter it. The exhibition is to a large degree curated by queers and people with disabilities. The contemporary artists exhibited largely self-identify as disabled and queer. Sandel points out, those who claim both identities may be best positioned to illuminate their connections to pinpoint where queerness and cryptum intersect, separate, and coincide. There's me, Birgit, and our assistant curator, Kate Brem, who is really in charge of all the access stuff and helped curate the contemporary art in the show. There's the banner for the show. So you can see we have the Venus de Milo on one side, and we have Joey Solomon's photograph, which I'll show you again later, self-portrait with me and Robert Andy Coombs in my dorm room. And we put them together because you don't want to know about the arguments I had with the marketing people. I said, you have to have both. Because you can't just have one, because then it looks like a show about gay men in wheelchairs. And you can't have just that, because people are going to think it's some, antique show of some sort.